Welcome to the deep dive. This is where your curiosity really guides us. You send in the sources, and, well, we dig in to pull out the key insights, the goal, to get you incredibly well informed, but without feeling buried in information.
Exactly. And today, we're diving into something really fascinating. The history of Hinduism in Kerala. We've got a great mix of sources you provided, articles, some research papers, it looks like.
Yeah, really rich set. So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We want to unpack the unique story of how Hinduism evolved in Kerala, God's own country, and get a handle on where things stand now, all tailored so you can grasp the most important bits.
And that nickname, God's own country, it actually points to something important, doesn't it? Kerala's got this incredibly long history of religious diversity, lots of trade. It's key context.
Absolutely. You've had Hindus living alongside Muslims, Christians, even Jewish communities for, well, centuries. It sets the stage for a very particular kind of Hinduism.
Right. Because Hinduism itself, generally speaking, it's ancient, super flexible, have all these diverse traditions, and this amazing ability to sort of weave together Vedic ideas with local indigenous elements.
Okay, so let's tackle this huge history. Where do we start? Right at the very beginning, I suppose.
Makes sense? To really get Kerala's Hinduism, you've got to go back to the earliest practices. Think indigenous Dravidian traditions.
Like nature worship and lots of different gods.
Yeah, polytheism, animistic beliefs, seeing spirits in nature, and a really deep respect for ancestors. This wasn't just belief, it was like woven into daily life.
And it's amazing how some of that still echoes today, right? Like
Yeah.
Vayam in North Kerala or Budakola further south.
Exactly. These incredible ritual art forms, they actually started before the big Vedic influence arrived, but now they're totally part of the Hindu tradition there.
And wasn't there an early reputation for sorcery, invoking spirits and things?
There was, yeah. Often tied to protection, well-being. Then, after this period, you start seeing the gradual arrival, the assimilation of Vedic and Brahmanic traditions.
So, Aryan settlers moving in slowly, bringing Brahmanism, the beginnings of caste, worship of gods like Vishnu, Shiva, Ganesha.
Right. This really starts taking shape around the middle of the first millennium CE, though, there might have been earlier contact back in the Kankam age.
And the Brahmins, they played a pretty active role in all this, didn't they? Not just priests, but warriors, administrators settling down south.
Definitely. After the Mauryan era, during the Sangam period, they brought Brahmanism, Vedism, but they also quite skillfully incorporated older local traditions, animist, agama, tantra stuff, even king worship.
What kind of specific things did they introduce?
Well, the sources suggest things like rice cultivation, maybe as early as the 5th century AD, also the Sanskrit language, Vedic culture, and that Agama Tantra style of temple worship, where you embody the spirit gods in images.
And people were receptive. They got land grants for temples.
They did. They gained favor pretty early on. It shows a certain openness, perhaps.
It's wild to think that even ancient Sangam Tamil texts called Keralites Hindus who revered the Ganga River. And then you have Chera coins with Shiva's symbols on them.
Yeah, the Trishula, the axe. It all points to this early integration.
Okay, let's talk myths. These seem really central to Kerala's Hindu identity. The Parashurama legend, for instance.
Oh, huge. Kerala as Parashurama as Kerala. The story goes he's an avatar of Vishnu, throws his axe, reclaims land from the sea.
Maybe gives it to the Brahmins, right, setting up Brahmin and Shudra communities.
Exactly. And there are interesting parallels drawn with a Chera king, Velkazu Kutavan. These stories, written down much later, like 16th century in texts like Kerala Mahatmya and Kerala Padi, they really shaped how people understood the land's origins and, importantly, the social structure.
Then there's the Mahabali legend. That's the heart of Onam, isn't it?
It is the story of the super prosperous, benevolent king Mahabali, or Malveli. He was so good the gods got jealous.
And Vishnu, as the dwarf Vamana, tricks him, banishes him, but lets him come back once a year for Onam.
That's the one. A really cherished story. And interestingly, some sources connect its popularization with Brahmins gaining more control over common land.
So these myths weren't just stories, they had a kind of socio-political function.
It certainly looks that way. The Parashurama story underpinning Brahmin land control and caste origins, Mahabali Vamana linked to authority over common land. They seem to provide a kind of divine stamp of approval on the social order.
Legitimizing Brahmin dominance and the caste system as it developed.
Pretty much. They became powerful tools for justifying the hierarchy. Beyond these big ones, you find mentions in other texts too, the Matsya Purana, Atarya Aranyaka, even the Ramayana and Mahabharata, touch on the region.
So the connections are there in the textual tradition. What about actual, historical evidence from back then?
We do have solid stuff. Ashoka's inscription from the 3rd century BCE mentioning Keralaputra, that's a big one.
And the spice trade. Pepper bringing in Greeks and Romans.
Absolutely. By the last few centuries BCE, the region was part of the larger Tamilakam area, sometimes under Pandya, Chola, or Chera influence in the early centuries CE.
And we know about other communities arriving early, too.
Yes, Jewish immigrants in the 1st century CE. And local Christian tradition puts St. Thomas the Apostle's visit around the same time. Then really concrete proof comes later, around 850 AD, with Chera Perumal Kings' copper plate grants.
Oh, do those.
They explicitly mention pre-existing Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities receiving privileges. It's solid evidence of that early pluralism we talked about.
So it's crystal clear. The Hinduism we see in Kerala today wasn't just imported wholesale. It's a real synthesis.
Totally. It absorbed that archaic nature worship, the Dravidian folk religion, polytheistic pagan elements, blending them with the Vedic and Brahmanic ideas that came later. Hinduism's flexibility allowed for this.
Right. Not a conquest, more like an integration.
A dynamic integration. And again, those myths we discussed played their part in shaping the social structure that emerged from that mix, particularly bolstering Brahmin influence and the caste system.
And that early constant interaction with other religions due to trade, Jewish, Christian, later Muslim communities, that must have really fostered a unique, maybe more fluid religious identity.
Absolutely. That pluralism is key. It encourages syncretism, a blending of ideas, and perhaps a less rigid definition of religious boundaries early on.
Okay, moving forward in time into the medieval period, say 9th to 18th century CE, it feels like the ruling dynasties really step into the spotlight here, shaping Hinduism in a big way.
That's a really crucial point. Their influence was immense. Take the Chera dynasty ruling from way back 3rd BCE up to the 12th CE. Part of Tamilakam initially, influenced by Pandya's Cholas.
But then the Kulasakara dynasty phase, around 800 to 1102 CE, that seems like a major shift.
It was. You see Malayalam starting to emerge as a distinct language, and Hinduism really gains prominence. They actively supported Tamil too, set up learning centers, universities.
And they were committed patrons of Hinduism, building temples like Sabarimala.
Yes, very much so. But interestingly, they were also tolerant of Buddhism and Jainism, which were still around. And their architectural legacy, those temples, palaces with intricate carvings, murals of myths, is still visible today.
The Kulasakaras, the Second Chera Empire, often called the Golden Age of Kerala, right? 9th to 12th centuries.
Exactly. Their capital, Mahodayapuram, modern Kodongalur, was a huge trade port. This stability fostered amazing growth in arts, literature, architecture. Those magnificent temples, Tamil and Sanskrit literature flourishing.
And rulers like Kulasakara Alwar, the poet saint.
A key figure, one of the Vaishnava Alvars. The kings took the title Perumal, heavily patronized Vaishnavism. Hinduism made, phenomenal progress during this time. Jainism and Buddhism declined.
But there were challenges, wars with the Cholas and Rashtrakutas.
It's constant wars. And one side effect was that it actually increased the socioeconomic power of the Namboothiri Brahmins. Things got complicated. Some schools and temples even got turned into kalalis, military training centers.
So a dynamic period, intense religious activity, but also conflict and shifting power balances.
Very much so. Then, after the Cheras declined, you get the Venad kingdom emerging, which later becomes Travancore in the 18th century.
And their rulers claimed descent from earlier chieftains, even the Chera Perumals, adopting the Varma surname.
Yes, claiming Kashya status. The Sri Padmanabha Swami temple in Thiruvananthapuram became absolutely central to their arts, economy, religious life, and they famously practiced Marumagathyam, the matrilineal succession system.
Wasn't Raja Martanda Varma a key figure there? Ascended in 1729.
Hugely important. He defeated the Dutch at Kolokol, a major victory, expanded Venad into Travancore, and adopted European military discipline, which is quite forward-thinking.
And he did that famous dedication, the Tribadadanami, giving the kingdom to the deity.
Exactly. He ruled as Padmanabha Dasa, servant of Padmanabha. His crown even symbolically featured the deity's feet. The Travancore royals were known for their piety, striving for Ramaraja ideals, patrons of Vedic culture, elaborate rituals, very close ties with Brahmins.
He even made sure there were daily offerings at the temple for everyone.
Daily rice and milk for devotees and the poor. It speaks to that ideal of the pious ruler.
We also need to talk about the Zamrins of Calicut. They ruled for a really long time, didn't they?
From around the 12th century right into the British period, Calicut, or Kozhikode, was a massive international port spices going to Arabia, China, Europe.
And they were big patrons of arts and culture, too. Kathakali, Kalaripayattu.
Yes, supported poets like Tumkathu Ezhuthachan. They influenced temple architecture, like the Thali Temple, were active in religious festivals and temple administration. Their policies shaped the social fabric, including supporting the matrilineal system in their region.
And didn't they encourage some conversions to Islam for practical reasons?
They did, interestingly, persuaded some coastal subjects to convert to Islam to beef up their navy, especially against the Portuguese threat. And you even had Hindu rulers giving money to build mosques. Shows a complex picture.
Okay, let's pivot to the caste system during this medieval period. It seems to have become uniquely rigid in Kerala.
It really did. What's striking is that the early Sangam literature before 2 AD doesn't mention caste like this. It suggests it developed later.
Possibly linked to Aryan Brahmanism merging with local traditions, leading to a sort of theocratic feudalism.
That's the theory. Initially, it might have been more about occupation, not birth. Untouchability, unapproachability weren't so pronounced. Scholars could even have equal status to Brahmins in court if they had the merit.
But that changed. By the 9th century, the Brahmins really organized and consolidated power.
Yes, they gained political clout, strengthened the caste system. The Namboothiri Brahmins emerged at the very top. They got land, became the landed aristocracy, the Janmimar, alongside Nair monarchs, right up until quite recently.
And it was exceptionally rigid. Nambuthiris above even other Brahmins, strict marriage rules.
Extremely rigid. Nairs were warriors lower down. Izavas, often laborers dealing with coconut trees. Pulayas were at the bottom, agricultural labor, sometimes slaves. And the Nairs uniquely kept matrilineal and matrilocal systems.
And the ritual pollution aspect sounds incredibly severe.
It was among the most extreme in India. Not just untouchability, but unapproachability, even unseeability. Sources mention Nairs being allowed to kill Pulayas on sight on highways in some cases. Lower castes were called Tental Jati, polluting from a distance.
How did the Brahmins become so dominant, landowners and all that?
Through alliances, taking over former Buddhist temples. By the 11th century, they were the biggest landowners. And their origin myth, the Parashurama story, gave them this divine justification for control over villages.
Did everyone accept this?
Generally, Shaiva and Vaishnava followers did. Jains and Buddhists often resisted. And converts, especially from Buddhism, often got pushed down into the Avarna or untouchable category.
So across all these dynasties, Cheras, Kalasakaras, Venad, Zamarins, there's this constant pattern of deep royal involvement with Hinduism.
Unmistakable. Kings as patrons. Kings tracing lineage to Vedic culture. Kings dedicating kingdoms to deities. Kings managing temples. They saw themselves as holders of Dharma, and temples were crucial economic and social hubs.
And the caste system, it really looks like it evolved from something perhaps less rigid into a pretty exploitative structure.
The timeline suggests that. Its absence in early texts, its emergence with Brahmanism and feudalism, the rise of priestly power coinciding with increasing rigidity and oppression, extreme pollution, classifying converts as untouchables. It adapted to maintain hierarchy.
But despite all this top-down Brahmanical influence, those older indigenous practices, they survived.
Absolutely. Local deities like Bhagavathi remained hugely important. Rituals like the Yam, which predate Vedic Hinduism, were absorbed but kept their vitality. It shows a two-way street. Local traditions persisted, even flourished sometimes, giving Kerala Hinduism its unique flavor.
So it's like two streams running together, Brahmanical influence building the hierarchy, but local Dravidian and folk traditions providing this continuous, vital undercurrent.
That's a great way to put it. We have a table summarizing these dynasties too, which helps visualize who contributed what.
Right, useful for keeping track. Now, things changed dramatically again with the arrival of Europeans from the 16th century. This must have reshaped Hinduism in Kerala profoundly.
Oh, profoundly. Starting with the Portuguese in 1498, Vasco da Gama. Their motives were mixed spices and Christians.
Initially welcomed, but then conflict over trade monopolies.
Yes, and they brought a very strong Catholic zeal. They forcefully Latinized the St. Thomas Christians, imposing Latin rites over their ancient Syriac liturgy. They persecuted Jewish communities who found refuge in Cochin.
And their attitude towards Hindus.
Not good. Forced conversions to Catholicism, systematic destruction of Hindu temples, especially notoriously in Goa. But they also brought new crops, cashews, tobacco, pineapples, papayas, influenced Malayalam a bit, spurred some urbanization.
Then the Dutch took over in the 17th century. Were they different?
Mostly commercial interests, the spice trade.
Mm.
Generally more religiously tolerant. We see records of them making offerings to Hindu temples. There's a Dutch bell at Varkala, lamps at Harippadu.
But it still got involved in local politics.
Sometimes, yeah. Led to conflicts, like their big defeat by Martanda Varma at Kolashel in 1741. Their big cultural legacy is the Hortus Indicus Malabaricus, that amazing book on medicinal plants. Some architectural influence, too.
Okay, then the Mysorean invasions under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan in the late 18th century, that sounds like a really tough period.
It was brutal, according to many sources. Driven by controlling the pepper trade and expansion, Tipu Sultan's approach was particularly aggressive. Enforced conversions to Islam, destruction of Hindu temples. It caused huge resentment, rebellions, often called the darkest period for Islamic atrocities by some accounts.
Had wider effects.
Big time. Weakened the old feudal system, massive economic disruption. And all this turmoil basically opened the door for the British East India Company to step in, offering support to local rulers against Mysore and expanding their own influence.
Which leads us neatly into the era of British rule, early 19th century to 1947. What were the major impacts then?
Huge impacts. The company took direct control of Malabar, North Kerala, and had massive influence over Travancore and Cochin. They introduced English education, a double-edged sword, really. Catalyst for reform and nationalism, but also brought Western norms.
Like impacting the matrilineal system, Marumakathiam.
Exactly. That system declined sharply, driven by British legal ideas favoring patriarchy, codified laws that treated family units differently, economic shifts towards wage labor making joint families less essential, and Christian missionary influence teaching against it.
So British law actively undermined it.
Yes, court decrees gave control of family property, Theravāds, only to males, stripping female heads, Karnavadis, of authority based on Western ideas. Eventually, local laws were passed allowing partition of joint families, individual property rights, culminating in an act in 1976 that legally abolished the system.
What about caste under the British? Did things improve?
Ironically, no. By the late 19th century, many argue Kerala's caste system was the most complex and exploitative in India. British pacification removed traditional checks like fear of armed reprisal from lower castes, allowing upper castes to intensify exploitation. Ritual pollution got even worse.
So British rule kind of entrenched hierarchies.
In many ways, yes. Though missionary schools did offer education, eventually to lower castes too, providing some mobility. The British also took control of Hindu temples, recognizing their wealth and power.
They took over temple administration.
Yes, starting with regulations in 1817, merging temple income with state revenue. Later acts reaffirmed state control, especially over Hindu temples specifically.
So colonial rule sounds like a real mix. Persecution, trade focus, then the British bringing modernization but also worsening caste issues and taking over temples.
It's complex and contradictory. Economic drivers were huge spices for the Portuguese Dutch. The shift to a capitalist economy under the British undermining old systems like matrilineal. And that paradox of British rule enabling more caste exploitation is really striking.
Wow. Okay, amidst all this turmoil and inequality, the 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of major social and religious reform movements. This must have been a crucial turning point.
Absolutely transformative. Movements sprang up to fight these injustices, redefine religious identity, and the leaders came from different backgrounds.
Let's start with Sri Narayana Guru, from the Azava community, right?
Oh,
That's a lot of discrimination.
Yes, a hugely influential philosopher, spiritual leader, social reformer. He led the charge against the caste system, pushing for spiritual enlightenment and social equality.
His famous saying, one caste, one religion, and one God for all human beings.
That's the one. Powerful stuff. And his actions were revolutionary, like installing a Shiva idol himself at Aruvipuram in 1888, directly challenging the Brahmin monopoly on that.
And he opened temples to everyone.
Over 40 temples open to all castes, even non-Hindus. He founded the SNDP Yogam with Dr. Palpu in 1903 to uplift Azavas through organization, education, economic means, opened schools for lower caste kids, supported the Vaikom Satyagraha, organized India's first all-religion conference, always stressing education and economic well-being.
Then there was Chatampi Swamakal. What was his focus?
A Hindu sage and reformer who attacked orthodox interpretations, baseless customs. He wanted to reform what he saw as a ritualistic, caste-ridden Hindu society, advocated for women's rights, vegetarianism, nonviolence, believed in the unity of religions.
And he made knowledge more accessible.
Big time. Through his teachings, his disciples, Sanskrit and the Vedas became accessible to all castes, breaking down barriers. He inspired Nair and his Ava reform movements too. Temples started opening up more because of reformers like him.
And Ayankali from the Dalit Pulayar community.
Yeah.
His story sounds incredible.
Truly. Facing the absolute worst discrimination, he became a powerful Dalit reformer, challenged everything, demanded education, land rights, labor rights.
He defied the rules directly, dressing like upper castes, riding a bullock cart when Dalits were forbidden.
Exactly. Back in 1893. He mobilized the Pulayas, led a walk for freedom that sparked riots but was a huge act of defiance, fought for Dalit kids in public schools, organized maybe the first farm labor strike for fair wages.
And he founded an organization, too.
The Sadhu Jana Paripalana Sangam in 1907 for Dalit rights and education. He even got nominated to the Travancore Legislative Assembly in 1910, the first Pulaya member, instrumental in getting Pulaya women the right to cover their upper bodies. Just amazing courage.
These efforts clearly fed into larger movements, like the Vaikom Satyagraha.
Definitely. 1924-25. A landmark nonviolent fight against untouchability in Travancore. The specific goal was lifting the ban on lower castes using roads near the Vaikom temple.
And it got big support. Gandhi, Narayana Guru.
Widespread support. It was a major step towards ensuring lower castes could actually use public roads freely, which technically was allowed earlier but often denied in practice. And it really paved the way for temple entry movements elsewhere.
Which led to the massive Temple Entry Proclamation in 1936.
Issued by the Maharaja of Travancore, Chithira Thirunal Balarama Varma, it abolished the ban on marginalized communities entering Hindu temples in Travancore. A huge milestone.
Hailed across the board, seen as striking at caste discrimination?
Yes, and fostering Hindu unity. Also, pragmatically, it helped prevent conversions, especially to Christianity, which was a concern for the rulers. It was the first of its kind in India, princely state, or British India, set a precedent.
So the impact of all these reforms was massive, shifting towards a more inclusive Hinduism, challenging hierarchies.
Profound impact. Lower castes mobilized, seeking upward mobility. Missionary education played a role, too, creating a new middle class. And fear of conversions definitely pushed some upper castes to support reform. Hindu gurus are also actively countering missionary work.
But there were complexities, this idea of Hinduization.
Yes, that's a critical nuance. While offering liberation for some, for indigenous Dalit and Adivasi groups, their own spiritual practices, ancestor worship, local deities were sometimes dismissed as menial or black magic, replaced by Brahmanical norms. Some call it cultural colonization.
And uniquely in Kerala, the leadership really came from the lower castes themselves.
That's a key distinction from North India. Reform was largely driven by the lower castes. Figures like Narayana Guru, Ajava, Ayankali, Pulaya, their direct experience fueled the activism. It was very bottom-up.
And the motivation was a mix. Real desire for justice, but also this external pressure, the fear of conversions.
It seems so. The sources suggest the continued flow of the lower castes to Christianity compelled the upper castes to reconsider the reform process. The Temple Entry Proclamation was partly strategic to keep people within the Hindu fold, a mix of moral and pragmatic concerns.
So Hinduization was ambiguous, liberation, but also potential cultural loss for some groups.
Exactly. Access to mainstream temples sometimes came at the cost of their unique indigenous practices being marginalized or even erased. Opening temples could lead to eliminating local worship systems, resulting in a more uniform, Brahmanical Hindu identity.
We have another table outlining these reformers, which is helpful. It really shows the range of figures involved.
Yes, it highlights their specific contributions in that crucial period.
Okay, let's shift to the really vibrant cultural side, the unique religious practices and expressions that make Kerala Hinduism so distinct.
Right. This is where you see that blend of ancient Dravidian and later Vedic tantric influences come alive. Think about those distinctive ritual art forms.
Like the Yam in North Malabar.
Exactly. Evolved from tribal animistic roots. The performer becomes a sort of temporary vessel for the divine. Incredible costumes, face paint, chanting, the power of the drums like the chenda.
And it's performed in local shrines, not big stages, by lower castes traditionally.
Yes. Village shrines, ancestral homes, traditionally by communities like Pulayar, Vanan, Malayan. It fostered communal harmony, though historically there were caste restrictions on who could perform or patronize. Wathapan Deyam is special performed year-round, even includes Islamic elements.
Fascinating. What about Thiratham?
Another ancient ritual art from the north, dance, music, theater combined. Again, elaborate costumes, masks representing deities, demons, myths. seen as appeasing divine elements originating from Dravidian traditions, performed in shrines and homes.
And Kalamazoo, those amazing floor drawings with colored powders.
Intricate drawings of deities right on the floor. Columns picture a Zufu drawing,
Yeah.
often with patu or song. It's part of rituals like Ayaprantheatu, Pajakali Teatu, Sarpamthulal, serpent worship.
The colors are all natural. Rice, turmeric, charcoal.
Yes. Rice for white, turmeric yellow, charcoal black, lime turmeric mix for red, powdered leaves for green. Deities like Pajakali, Nagas, Ayapan are common, practiced by specific hereditary communities. The Naga Kalam for serpent worship is especially associated with the Pulavar community in central Kerala.
And Padayani. What's that involve?
Ritual art from central Travancore Bhadrakali temples. It's about appeasing Bhadrakali after she defeated the demon Dwarika. Artists wear these huge, spectacular masks and headgears called kolams representing Yakshi, Bakshi, Kullan, Ganapati. Really striking visually.
Moving to architecture, Kerala temples have a very specific look, don't they?
Very distinct. Influenced by broader Dravidian styles, but adapted beautifully to the climate, those heavy monsoons. Lots of wood, intricate carvings, steeply sloping roofs, usually tiled or copper sheeted, to let the rain run off.
In the inner sanctum, the sukoval is often simpler, circular or square.
Often, yes. You have the outer walls, prakaram, a flagstaff, kodimaram, a temple pond. The gopurams, the gateway towers, are usually more modest than in Tamil Nadu, for example. Lots of murals depicting myths. And that unique feature, the Kuthambalam, the temple theater.
All following Vastu Shastra principles.
Yes, the traditional science of architecture. Think of major temples like Padmanabhaswamy, Guruvayur, Vadakunathan, Sabarimala. They all share elements of this style.
And festivals. They must be central to cultural life. Onam, obviously.
The biggest. Ogsept, commemorating King Mahabali's return. 10 days, the flower carpets, Pukalam, the huge feast, Onam Sadhya, the snake boat races, Boam Kali. It's massive.
Then there's Vishu, the New Year.
In April, you have the Vishukani, that auspicious display you see first thing in the morning, and Vishu Kanetham, elders giving money to youngsters.
Trisur Puram sounds spectacular, too.
Oh, the grandest temple festival. At Vadakunathan Temple, comparison to elephants, amazing percussion ensembles, Pachavadiyam Melam, huge firework displays. It's a sensory overload in the best way.
And Attukal Pongala, the women's festival.
Unique and enormous. Millions of women gather at Attukal Temple in Thiruvananthapuram to cook pongal offerings in earthen pots. It holds the Guinness World Record for the largest religious gathering of women.
Beyond the big festivals, there are lots of social customs tied to Hinduism, too.
Definitely. Birth rituals like naming, namakaranam, first rice feeding, charunu, often done at a temple. Hindu weddings have many stages pre-wedding events, the main ceremony with specific rituals like Kanyadan, circling the fire, Mangal Sutra, then post-wedding rituals. Variations exist, but core ideas are similar. Death rituals involve cremation, collecting ashes, santinam, plus the unique cuisine, the sadhya on a banana leaf, classical arts like Kathakali, Mohiniyattam. It's all interwoven.
It really brings home how deep those folk roots run, doesn't it? Thiraitam, Kalamazuthu, coming from ancient traditions, often kept alive by lower caste communities.
Exactly. A huge part of Kerala Hinduism isn't just Vedic or Brahmanical. It's a direct continuation and integration of much older indigenous beliefs.
Even the temple architecture shows that practical adaptation, right? Sloping roofs for rain, modest gopurams, the theater space.
Perfectly adapted. It shows this integrated understanding of sacred space that responds to the environment and community needs. Pragmatic.
And the festivals clearly serve as massive community builders, preserving culture.
Absolutely. Onam, Thrissur Puram bring everyone together. Attukal Pongala shows incredible unity. They foster cultural pride, pass down heritage, strengthen that regional identity.
Okay, let's bring it up to the present. Hinduism in Kerala post-independence, 1947 onwards. What are the key dynamics now?
Well, it's still evolving. You see significant demographic shifts. Hinduism is still the largest religion, 54.7% in the 2011 census. But that share has been declining steadily for over a century. It was nearly 69% back in 1901.
And recent reports mention concerns about this trend.
Yes, a 2025 Center for Policy Studies report talked about an alarming shift, a looming demographic change, potentially impacting the state's whole fabric, religious, cultural, political.
What are the specific trends?
Key data points show Muslims surpassing Hindus in total live births sometime after 2015. For instance, in 2019, Muslims were about 27% of the population, but had around 44% of the births. Hindus were 54% of the population, but had about 41% of births.
So birth rates differ significantly.
It appears so. The Muslim birth share is much higher than their population share. Hindu and Christian shares are lower. Muslim population growth rate has been consistently higher since 1951, and the gap seems to be widening. Fertility rates, TFR, for Muslims have been consistently around 50% higher than for Hindus in recent surveys.
And Kerala's overall TFR is low.
Below replacement level, yes. But Muslim TFR is generally above that level. This means Muslim natural accretion births minus deaths is significantly higher. Hindu natural accretion dropped dramatically from over 100,000 in 2011 to just over 1,000 in 2021, according to that data.
So the official share is dropping.
Official data cited shows the Hindu share dropping from 54.73% in 2011 to 52.61% in 2021, while the Muslim share rose from 26.56% to 29.14%. These shifts have led some groups to raise concerns about things like love jihad and conversions.
Okay, those are significant numbers. What about the political scene in Kerala? How does that interact with the Hindu community?
Politics in Kerala is dominated by two main fronts. The Left Democratic Front, LDF, led by the Communist Party, Marxist, and the United Democratic Front, UDF, led by Congress. So a strong left-center-left tilt historically.
And the BJP, the Hindu Nationalist Party.
Despite the RSS having a very strong grassroots presence, lots of local branches, shakas, the BJP has had very limited electoral success in Kerala historically.
What about specific Hindu organizations? Are they influential?
Several are. The RSS, as mentioned, is a major force on the ground, though often accused by critics of trying to infiltrate state services, sometimes called saffronization. The Hindu Aikyavedi, HAV, is affiliated with the RSS, working to unite Hindu communities.
And community-specific groups.
Yes, the Nair Service Society, NSS, works for the Nair community, played a big political role post-independence, opposing communist land reforms during the liberation struggle. And the SNDP Yogam continues its vital work for Izava upliftment. There was also the Hindu Mahamanamlam, formed back in 1950, an early attempt at Hindu consolidation against perceived Christian influence and government interference in temples.
Temple administration still sounds like a tricky issue, politicized.
Increasingly so, many feel. Devaswam board members, who manage temples, are nominated by Hindu MLAs and ministers from the ruling government. Sometimes these nominees are seen as not being devout or even being non-believers.
Leading to concerns about autonomy, mismanagement.
Yes, infringing autonomy, potential corruption, mismanagement, alienating actual devotees. Remember, state control goes way back to the British era, and post-independence land reforms meant temples lost assets, making them more reliant on donations.
And those older issues of caste and gender discrimination, are they gone?
Unfortunately, no. Appointing non-Brahmin priests still causes controversy sometimes, despite Supreme Court rulings supporting it. The Sabarimala women's entry issue was huge, challenging the ban on women aged 10-50. The Supreme Court ruled for entry in 2018, but implementation faced massive protests and hurdles, and some temples still don't allow non-Hindus inside.
With all these changes, what's being done to preserve Kerala's Hindu heritage?
There are efforts. The Kerala Council for Historical Research, KCHR, does broad work documenting history, oral histories, archaeology. The Ministry of Culture offers support. Specific Hindu institutions exist too, like Tantra Vidyapitham, a traditional Vedic school founded in 1972, and Arsha Vidyasamajam, teaching Sanatana Dharma since 1999.
And interreligious relations today, it sounds complex.
It is. There's that long history of coexistence, Hindu, Muslim, Christian equilibrium, Hindu kings giving privileges to others, syncretism like Vavruswamy at Sabarimala, Hindus helping build mosques.
But also periods of conflict.
Definitely. Portuguese persecution, the Mysorean invasions, the Malabar Rebellion with its communal violence and forced conversions, the Murad beach killings in 2003, identified as a communal conspiracy. It's not a simple story of harmony.
And contemporary politics plays a role.
Yes, you see things like the BJP trying to align with Christians, sometimes framing narratives against Muslims, and those concerns about love jihad, voiced by some Hindu and Christian leaders, add another layer of tension.
So, wrapping up, the big contemporary challenges seem to be these demographic shifts, the politicization of religion, and the complexities of interfaith relations.
Those seem to be core issues. The declining Hindu population share is a major point of discussion and concern for many. The way temple administration gets tied up in state politics raises questions about religious autonomy. And the rise of Hindu organizations advocating for Hindu rights suggests a growing identity mobilization, which some worry could fuel communal tensions.
And that historical harmony, while real, isn't guaranteed. It faces pressures.
Exactly. It's always subject to the social and political currents of the time.
Okay, so as we finish this deep dive, the big takeaway really is that Hinduism in Kerala is this incredible story of constant adaptation, deep, deep cultural roots, and resilience.
Absolutely. We've journeyed from ancient blending of traditions through medieval flourishing and caste hardening, the shocks of colonialism, the huge impact of reform movements. It's quite a narrative.
And today we see these ongoing dynamics, the demographic shifts, the politics, the challenges in managing religious institutions and striving for social inclusion. It's still very much alive and changing.
But through it all, that legacy endures this capacity to adapt and this profound connection to Kerala's unique cultural landscape.
So for you, listening, maybe think about this. How will this constant dance between tradition and change shape Hinduism's future in Kerala? What does its long history of adapting tell us about its ability to handle today's challenges? And importantly, what role do you think understanding this complex history plays in how those future paths unfold? Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.